Sounds good. Thanks for the introduction, Beth.
Sure.
It says I can't share my screen until you stop sharing your
That
screen.
makes a lot of sense. Hold on.
Thank you.
How about now?
I think so. Can you see everything okay?
Yep. Looks good.
Okay. All right, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Kathryn Wysocki Gunsch, and as Beth mentioned, I work at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, but my first passion is Benin art. So I want to talk to you today about some of the Benin bronze plaques. We're going to focus on this one relief plaque, which is part of a series of more than 850 reliefs that hung in the audience hall of the Oba, or King of Benin, in the 16th and 17th centuries. I want to walk you through some themes you might approach with this work in your classroom: iconography of power, an artist's experimentation with new medium, art as it relates to architectural settings, structural racism in art history, and also provenance and ownership issues. Before we get started, and before you get started with your students, I really want to encourage you to do some geographical housekeeping. So I find that people on our tours and in classes often get confused between the Kingdom of Benin, which had its historical location, it's still centered in Benin City, Nigeria, and historically at its height kind of reached through the expanse that you see in that little yellow box, touching the border of the country of Benin. The country of Benin took its name from the Bight of Benin, which is the waterway in the red box, which was named for the Benin Kingdom. But the country of Benin has really nothing to do with Benin, the kingdom. So this is sometimes a confusion in class, and I encourage you to go through it quickly first so that your students know what you're talking about, which is the Benin Kingdom in Nigeria. So what are we looking at in this relief plaque? I chose this particular relief because it shows you the plaques installed in the palace. We're looking at 4 lower ranking courtiers standing in the audience hall of the Palace of Benin City at some point in the 16th century. The figures on the outside edges of the plaque are imada. Those are low ranking, the lowest rank you can be in the court. They're adolescents who are sent to the court for training and to pay service to the Oba. And then they would be given clothing by the Oba when they'd done some service for him. And at the time that they graduated, if you will, when they finished their service, they would either become higher ranking courtiers or they would leave the court with gifts from the king, a house, a farm, wives, that sort of thing. The 2 figures in the center are lower ranking courtiers, and we know that because of the height of their odigba. All of these figures are wearing a collar made of coral beads. Of course, here it's in bronze or brass, but those would have been given out by the Oba to his courtiers, and they're a signal of the Oba's favor. So when we see these figures wearing only very few strands of coral, we know that they're sort of lower ranking members of the palace hierarchy. I want to walk you through first the iconography of power that you see in this image. So in the center of the doorway, you see these very small, and you can see that I've zoomed in quite far to see these very small leopards. These might be images of aqua manile, which we have a leopard-shaped aqua manile in the Benin corpus existing today. And so they might indeed have been those. They could also be a metaphorical reference to the king, and indeed might be both things. In other plaques, we see the king manipulating leopards. So here we have an image of the Oba on the right. He's wearing a coral beaded tunic on top, a high crown projection with a coral beaded crown, which is a sign of leadership in this region at the time. He's wearing the bead of rule on his chest, and then he's holding leopards by their tails. And so you get this idea of the king and the power of the king manipulating such dangerous animals. But there's also a metaphorical praise name for the king, that he is the leopard of the palace, and that choice to compare him to this cunning predator is quite intentional. The King of Benin is seen as having incredible military power, especially in this moment in the 16th century when Benin had just grown to an empire. And he's also seen as not only strong, but cunning, right? That he's a smart, strategic military leader. And that reference to the leopard is meant to get at both ideas of power and lethal force, but also the concept of leopards as being very smart, cunning hunters. Another image of power that you see in this relief are the snake that's on top of the palace roof. So we see a snake, maybe a python, coming down on the roof of the palace. This is something that the artist observed in life. There were copper snakes appended to the roof of the palace in the 16th century. And that snake is a reference to the wealth of the king. So the god of wealth, Olokun, lives under the waters in Benin cosmology. And the king has direct relationship with Olokun and is responsible for the wealth coming into the kingdom. This is particularly interesting on a relief plaque made of a copper alloy. The Benin bronzes are, most of them, brass, actually, not bronze, but copper alloy is a unit of exchange in this region at the time. So this plaque, when it was on view in the courtyard, would have been kept bright and shining, and it would have been very clear to all visitors in the court that indeed they were looking at art made of currency, art made of wealth. And so this reference to wealth on the plaque that we're examining today, this snake referring to Olokun and the god of wealth and wealth under the waters through trade and exchange over the water, is one reminder, but the plaque surface itself, the glowing bronze color of it, would have been an even stronger reminder to visitors of the king's wealth. The last piece a piece of iconography I want to share with you relating to the king's power is a little hard to see. If you look at the zoom in image on the right here, you can see those little bird feet at the top, at the very, at the end of the snake's tail. And here I've circled them for you on the plaque. That's referencing, what's broken off is an image of an ibis, or what is called in Benin sort of oral history, the bird of prophecy. And that's a really important piece of iconography that's only a little bit extant on this plaque, but I wanted to call it to your attention because the bird of prophecy instantly makes us think of King Esigia, Oba Esigia, who reigned between 1517 and the 1550s. Esigia is the likely patron of the plaque corpus, and this bird relates to a particular moment in his reign that might explain why he wanted to commission something like the plaques. Esigia came to rule after a civil war with his brother Uruhan, and once he'd won the civil war, he of course inherited a kingdom that was, in disorder, right, with the lack of unity after a civil war, and that had suffered significant military losses. Almost immediately after he took the throne, the neighboring kingdom of Ida invaded. This is the only invasion of Benin territory in its history. This moment when the Ida invaded, and then when the British invade in 1897. So it's an unusual and major moment in the kingdom's history when Ida marches on the Benin kingdom. Esigia asks his senior courtiers for support in the war, and they turn him down, assuming that he will lose. So in the oral history, it's said that Esigia marches with his militia to battle, and he sees a bird in the tree, and the bird of prophecy tells him to turn back because he will die. And so Esigia orders his men to shoot the bird out of the tree and carries it into battle as his standard. When he returns to court, of course, there is more to repair than there was when he left. So not only did they just have a civil war, but the senior courtiers broke rank with him when he went to fight an enemy marching on the kingdom. Esigia spends the rest of his career as king, his very long reign, repairing that relationship between the king and his courtiers. And so this reference in the plaque we're examining today to that bird of prophecy brings us to the patron and the patron's possible goals. When we look more closely at the plaque, when we zoom in, we can see the little plaques that the artists have so carefully worked and put onto the surface of this relief. And as we examine the kinds of figures that are represented in this image, in these small images within the relief itself, we can get a sense of what Esigia was trying to accomplish. So we see in the yellow boxes, lower ranking courtiers, so Edo men who are serving the king. Then in the red boxes, we see high-ranking courtiers and religious authorities. So the two figures in the center pillars on the top in red boxes, those are high-ranking priests. The others are high-ranking courtiers. And then we see images of foreigners, in this case, primarily Portuguese figures. This plaque is sort of an index for the plaques overall, right? It gives you a sense of what you see in the entire corpus of 850. When you look at those plaques, you primarily find images of warriors, as you see on the left, a Benin warrior in battle, or of courtiers, as you see on the right. I think this scene on the left is a bit self-explanatory, although I always like to point out to people that this warrior is so vigorous and fierce in his work to support and further the aims of the king, that he's taken a man off his horse who's already been run through with a dagger. So I just find that a really great anecdotal detail for students to notice. And on the right, we see two high-ranking courtiers. You can remember that those Odigba collars, the coral collars that they're wearing, are a sign of favor from the king. And so their collars are coming up and almost over the lips, showing that they are really they have the king's favor and they're high ranking. They're holding these aben swords, a fish-shaped sword that has no cutting edge, that's used only for dance performances to honor the king. So the idea is to throw that up into the air and have it spinning and then catch it. And it's an act of praise and also sort of an act with religious significance. When you look through the corpus overall, you see images of high-ranking people honoring the king, of warriors fighting for the king, of the right relationship between courtiers and warriors and their leader. And that may indeed be why Esigio commissioned this monumental corpus in the first place, which is to show the way that the court should be behaving, the relationship that ought to exist between himself and his subjects. He seems to be successful. By the end of Esigio's reign, his son, or Hogbua, continued this corpus, but had the oral history reports that he had a much better relationship with his court than Esigio had inherited when he first came to the throne. So now I want you to look at these two plaques and to think a little bit about the artist's innovations in this moment. Relief plaques are not known in Benin until this commission, so they're a new form, a new medium for artists. Brass casting certainly existed before, but not relief plaques in this particular fashion. All Benin bronzes are made by the Agun Aranwan, which is the Royal Brass Casting Guild of Benin, and they work for the king. In this period, they worked exclusively for the king and could only make bronzes for others with the king's permission. You're looking at an image of two plaques. One, the one that we've been looking at today with the palace, is a wide plaque. The other is a narrow plaque. The entire corpus is divided essentially in half between wide and narrow plaques. The wide plaques are 30 to 40 centimeters wide. The narrow plaques are nearly all exactly 19 centimeters, and they function together to sheath a column. So we'll talk about what that means in a moment. The circle is highlighting for you the edge of the plaque where you would find a flange or a little piece of the plaque surface that continues in a right angle around the side. And the idea is that those flanges met up with the narrow plaques to create a sheath for the column. So don't worry, I'll unpack that a little more. Here are images of flanges, so that curving surface of coming over from the front of the plaque. And you can see that they have patterns on them. I don't really have time to dive into this today, but those patterns seem to have a temporal relationship to the plaques. That, in other words, that the plaques are made, the curved plaques are made first, the angle plaques second, and the double woven plaques third, perhaps over a period of about 30 years. When you divide the plaques up into the patterns on the sides, there are only patterns in the wide plaques. So when you group those by the patterns on their sides, you see a real shift in compositional strategies and in style. So the earlier plaques, the curved plaques, tend to have non-figural decoration. 36% of that corpus is non-figural decoration. And then the figural decoration tends to only have one figure. Also, the reliefs are much flatter and they have a lot of negative space. There's a lot of free space in the plaque. Then by the time we get to the double woven plaque, so all the way on the end, on the right on your screen, we have much, much higher relief, a much busier composition. Nearly all of the space is used by the artist. And there's almost a sense of freestanding figures. 99% of that corpus is figural. The angle group, which is in the center here, is sort of in the middle, as you might imagine, a little bit higher relief. Definitely more figures, but not that same emphasis almost entirely on the figure that you see in the latest group of plaques, and not that same high relief. Those changes that we see over time are a result of artists possibly becoming more comfortable with this medium of relief. It might be useful in class as an exercise for students to compare side by side an earlier image of the palace that you see on the left, that's in the Berlin collection, the Berlin Ethnographic Museum, or a later relief of the palace, so they can see just how similar these compositions are, and yet how artists treat them very differently when they're working later in time and have greater confidence in the medium of bronze casting in relief. It also may be possible, well, we'll get to that in a moment. So when I think about the bronze reliefs that you might have spoken of with your students before, I of course think about the Florentine baptistry doors and the famous comparison of the composition piece made by Ghiberti versus Brunelleschi, and then the back of those pieces. And I wanted to share with you today so you can talk to your students about bronze casting and the different way that Benin bronze casters were working. So Ghiberti and Brunelleschi both built up the front of their plaque competition pieces And then Ghiberti famously excavated the back of that wax model for the plaque before, and Brunelleschi did not. And that might have been a factor in who won the competition and got the commission for the baptistry doors. If you compare the back of a Benin bronze plaque to the back of Ghiberti's baptistry door panel, you can see that the Benin artist was not excavating the back of his plaque at all. He was building it up over an existing clay form. So there's that perfect outline of the figures. It's just a very different way of creating a relief plaque than the Florentine artists a century before. And I think it's important for students to just understand the way that the relief plaques are made. So they're built over this model, and that might have helped the leader of the guild keep so precisely the sizes that are important for the architectural function of these plaques wrapping the pillars, because they do have such precise measurements. It's possible that using a clay form, perhaps even aided with a mold to make that clay base for the relief before it was built in wax and then invested and fired to make the mold for the plaque itself. You know, perhaps that was one way that the guild head was keeping track of the sizes, keeping them uniform. So back to our plaques, I want to get to one other point about brass casting, and then we'll think about these in architectural contexts. So you should know that not only were Benin plaques built in this different way, sort of built over a clay form so that you didn't need to excavate the back, but that it was already excavated, if you will, by the mold itself. But also Benin bronze casters do not chase the form after it is completed in the lost wax casting. So instead, and I'm sorry that I haven't gone over lost wax casting, but speaking to a group of art history professors, I imagine I don't need to for you. But as you know, frequently in Europe and in other parts of the world, artists finish their bronze casting in the mold, you know, break the mold free, and then finish all the details with the chisel. That's not the way it works in Benin. All of the details that you see in both of these plaques were made in the wax form, and then an incredibly fine clay, likely a kaolin, was invested over the top of them before, you know, coarser levels of clay were added to make the mold, and then fire it and fill it. So the details you're seeing here are details made directly into the wax and not details made with a chisel afterwards. So when we look at these two plaques together, and I have them side by side, the one in London that we're thinking about most today and the one in Berlin that is an earlier version of the same composition, I wanted them both up to remind you of that shift over time in relief, that the later plaques, like the London plaque, are very, very high relief, and that they have more figures, and to think about why an artist might have made a change in style and composition over time. And when we realize that these are elements of architectural decor and meant to be installed in the palace, as you see in the plaque itself, it's showing you a courtyard impluvium. So it's part of the veranda of an impluvium style courtyard, and the plaques are on the pillars holding up that veranda roof. Then you imagine how one would see it. So this is a very basic SketchUp model of what it might have looked like to walk into the 16th century audience hall of the Oba of Benin. And you can see this is a large space. It's roughly 30 by 60 meters. And so anyone walking into this space is looking at the plaques from a great distance, except for the ones right next to them on the palace pillars. And so it's possible that the change in style over time that the Benin bronze casters engaged in, that wasn't just about confidence with the medium, but was also about an understanding of the reception of these works as they were installed in the audience hall and how well they functioned for their purpose of ornamenting this very large architectural space. Another class activity I thought you might want to bring to your students would be comparing the impression that artwork makes when it's in a museum on its own versus still seen in situ. So what's the difference between understanding, you know, the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the Last Judgment fresco and the frescoes underneath them when you walk into the Sistine Chapel versus understanding Peter Paul Rubens' cycle for Catherine de' Medici taken out of the Palace of Luxembourg and put into the Louvre in the same way that the Benin plaques have been taken you know, out of the palace, seized by the British and distributed across the world. So you can't really see them in the way that they were initially intended to be viewed. You know, how do students respond to art in situ versus responding to it in a museum setting? How easy or hard is it to imagine where the artwork originally was installed and how it was meant to be experienced? So I think that might be a useful thing for students to talk through in your classes. I think that we're in a moment where it's important for students also to understand the impact of structural racism on the way that they have seen art and the way that they've been taught art or may read about it when they encounter particular narratives in art history books. You're looking here at Charles Reed and Armand Dalton on the left, the two curators of the British Museum when the Benin plaques were seized and brought to London by British occupying forces. And then on the right, you see Felix von Luschan and his wife. He was the curator at the Berlin Ethnographic Museum who bought probably the world's largest or second largest collection of Benin art from auctions in the UK. All three of these men are anthropologists, and all three of them were working in a time when social Darwinism, the false belief that that we could ascertain the wealth or achievement, the worth or achievement of different races based on their material culture. Definitely one of those ideas that props up white supremacy. These are men who are working in that moment, in that context. And so when they looked at Benin art, they primarily were looking for evidence of material culture. They were comparing that art to European art and its fineness or supposed aesthetic achievement. They were really looking from this myopic European lens that had the goal of showing how much better European art was. And sorry, I'm a little distracted because I'm working at home and I can hear everyone in my kitchen talking quite loudly. So I hope you can't hear them too. Just as an example of that, a lot of Benin art historical writing in the early 20th century and even later is obsessed with the appearance of Portuguese figures in the corpus. And indeed, on the plaque we've been examining today, there are Portuguese figures depicted. But Portuguese figures are only 8% of the overall corpus of Benin bronze reliefs that would have been in this monumental installation. And that includes tiny little figures of Portuguese men drinking, as you see in the corners of the plaque on the right. So these are not a main focus of Benin, of the corpus or the cycle at all. They're there, but they're not a main focus. And that focus on the presence of the Portuguese, for example, eclipses really interesting and overlooked images of other foreigners, so non-Edo people who were not part of the Benin kingdom, but neighbors, like this plaque on the right that likely depicts the Ata of Ida, the ruler of the Ida people who attacked Benin City right after Sigia came to the throne. So it might be useful for students to think about how Benin writing has changed over time and why early writings on Benin art aren't looking at very basic questions like who commissioned this art, who made it, why did they try to make it, how did it hang, what was the point of this monumental installation, and the incredible outlay of funds that it must have required. All of those basic questions about artistic agency and the agency of patrons, questions about reception, who saw this and what did it mean, those questions didn't get asked for decades and decades and decades when looking at Benin art. And I think that might be a valuable thing for students to consider and think about, and how that affects their own knowledge of Benin art. When students come into your classroom to talk about Benin, the thing they're going to know most about Benin is the repatriation requests from the palace and from the country of Nigeria. This is a rendering of the soon to be built Edo Museum of West African Art. The rendering is by David Ajayi. And I wanted to show you this image to talk to you about something interesting I heard last week by Philip Iheanacho, who's the head of the Legacy Restoration Trust. That is the group that represents both the Oba, or King of Benin, and the Nigerian Museums and Monuments Commission in receiving things back from countries that are trying to repatriate. Philip said in a planning meeting for the museum a week or two ago, if I had my choice, I would not have anything about the moment of 1897, the moment of the British invasion and occupation of Benin City in the museum at all. I would never mention that moment, because that moment is not the most important moment in the story of Benin art and history. It's not even close to the most important moment. It's a moment, and I don't want to privilege it above the others. And so I want to encourage you when you're designing your classes to think about how much time you want to give to the conversation of repatriation and restitution. It's an important issue, it's an ethical issue, it's a timely issue. And so of course it's something worth discussing. But I think it's also worth thinking about the agency of how we focus on the agency of patrons and artists and avoid that Europe-centric myopia that the anthropologists who first studied Benin art got trapped into, right? That we want to make sure the story is centered around Benin and not centered around the British, which was another point that Philip made in discussing the interpretation expected in this museum. I just wanted to share with you the story of 1897 as seen through Benin eyes. On the right is a sculpture that was commissioned by Oba Radiawa in the 1980s. It's on the Ring Road near the current museum in Benin City. And on the left is a relief from the Esogban's Palace. That's a high-ranking courtier in Benin. And both of them show Asoro, a legendary warrior, dressed in 16th century garb like you would see in the palace plaques, vanquishing British soldiers at that moment. And so I kind of want to share that with you also, to share that the Benin City history of 1897, that the way that the kingdom itself is looking at this moment is, of course, as a moment of occupation. Of course, they're mentioning they're calling for the restitution of their work, but the idea of Benin as a victim is not maybe the portrait we want to paint for our students, but to show in the same way that Benin artists today and Benin, the rulers of Benin, the former Oba of Benin is depicting this moment to show Benin agency in 1897 as in other parts of its history. So finally, I just want to end with this image of the plaque and kind of to wrap up and say that the plaque of plaques that we've talked about today on the left in the British Museum has sort of this rich story that we can tell about the iconography of power, about the larger installation, the monumental installation that this one plaque is part of, understanding what Esigia was trying to achieve with this work and how he did achieve repairing his relationship with the court after coming to the throne after two major battles. So just kind of pointing out the history that we can bring about Benin art and Benin artists to the classroom, in addition to these contemporary ethical conversations, which are important, but sort of an addition to the main story of Benin art, creativity, and accomplishment. So thanks for listening to me today. I appreciate being here.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was fascinating. And let's see, maybe I'll pin myself too, and we can ask some questions. Let's see, yeah, spotlight, maybe that did it. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, please post them in the Q&A and I'll be happy to sift through them and ask Kathryn. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a couple of questions that I have. I wonder if you could speak to, because I imagine this coming up for students, the size of the corpus, because it's so distributed, it's really hard to get a sense of it.
Yeah, so there's more than 850 bronze plaques, and you could imagine them reinstalled as four, just as you saw in the plaque we were looking at, 4 plaques per side of a 4-sided column. So 16 plaques sheathing a column. And we know from a trader who came to the palace in 1702 that he counted 58 pillars in most of the courts that he went to. So the court is a series of impluvia. So you can walk through and go into different audience courts. But most of the ones, he counted the pillars in the first one. And then when he walked into the next ones, he said, these have about the same number of pillars. So we have a sense that it's roughly 58 pillars. Thank you to that trader. And in the 1640s, we have a trader who came in and compared the size of the audience hall where the plaques were installed. He saw the plaques installed to the exchange in Amsterdam, which measured 30 meters by 60 meters. So putting these two things together, we have a sense of the rough distribution of the pillars, perhaps, and the size of the palace, and then looking at the eyewitness images of the plaque that we have from the Benin artists themselves, we can see, yes, there were about 4 on each side and kind of count them up that way. So you can come to an imaginary of what it might have looked like to have these installed.
And just a quick follow-up, and then I'll get to the question from our viewer today, but do we know how many impluvia, how many rooms there were?
No, so the palace burned down a few times between the 16th century and the present. Some of the roof had wood tiles covered in bronze, but some in bronze sheet, but some of the roof had grass. And so it's not uncommon for those things to, for it to burn, to have a thatched roof burning. So no, it's not entirely clear. There were wars also in 1702. It was right after a number of wars. And so some of the courts were cast down. You can see the court today on Google Earth. So I do encourage students to go and take a look at how the court is situated, how the architecture works by just looking at Google Earth at the Opus Palace in Benin City.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions. So they were made in the 16th and 17th century. Did they continue to make them after that?
So I don't think so. So the the scholarship had projected, so I just want to be transparent and say that I don't think so. I don't think they were made after that time. So in the past, scholars thought that these began to be made in the 16th century based on details of Portuguese costume, and that they continued to be made probably till the end of the 17th century, because after 1702, no European visitors see them installed. But then some scholars thought that maybe they continued to be made into the 19th century. I'm looking at them and seeing the way that they are made together and the way that they complete one architectural ensemble. And I don't think it makes sense that you would take 100 years to complete ornamenting that hall, because they are also tightly interconnected in their iconography and the way that they function together across the space. The Benin artists have used a method of series and doubling to kind of link the space. So they've made pairs, you know, in lost wax bronze casting, you can't actually make a pair, but they made an effort to create paired compositions to sort of bring your eye together across the space. All of this suggests to me that someone's working to create one monumental installation and not sort of adding to it drib drab over time. And when we look at the oral history on the plaques in 1898, Benin courtiers reported that these were made for Asiya and his son, or Hogbua. So that's a narrower time frame too. So I think these were made only in the 16th century, but there's definitely scholarship out there suggesting they were made for maybe 150 years.
Great.
They're not made today. Well, they're made today in a much larger format, a display format, like 4 times the size of a historical plaque. And you can find them in courtiers' homes. You can find them sometimes in high rank, very fancy hotels. So the Agunaram one are still working, the Royal Bronze Casting Guild, and they make contemporary versions of the plaques for display, but they're not made for this purpose anymore.
Oh, cool. Are they made for a tourist audience? They're only made for just...
You could buy them as a tourist, I suppose, but they're big. They're big and very heavy.
Yeah,
so they tend to have more of a local audience. Of high-ranking courtiers might have them in their house, or historically you could find really nice hotels in Lagos would maybe have them, or in Benin City. So they became contemporary art objects as opposed to, not usually for tourists tend to buy bracelets and things that are more portable, right. But the plaques.
Okay, a few more questions have come in. Do you have any advice for teaching the development of artistic technique in Benin in the context of exchange with neighboring groups or even cultures at a greater distance?
That's a great question. I think historically, the Benin art has been compared to Europa art, and there's been a theory that maybe Benin learned bronze casting from Yoruba kingdoms like Ife. And there's a theory that I find as a Benin scholar, I'm maybe a little partial, but this idea that Benin art is degenerating from Ife, that Ife was more naturalistic and therefore better, and the Benin art is worse. When you look at how Ife heads were cast and how Benin bronze heads are cast, they don't cast them in the same method. I don't really think that there was necessarily a relationship between Ife casting and Benin casting. So I'm not really sure that there is a great linkage for the way that Benin casting is working with other regional centers, or not one that I find very plausible. Typically, when you see one bronze casting center teaching another bronze casting center, the very basics of how you cast, whether you cast the head right side up or upside down, for example, are copied into the new culture. You don't really see that in the relationship between Ife and Benin. So I don't actually have a great example of that. But I think there are select plaques you could pick up that show neighboring peoples material culture. And you could email me, I'd give you the accession numbers if you liked. But there are some showing, for example, Igala bells being carried by warriors who may or may not be Benin people. They might be foreigners. There's a plaque that I showed of the Ata Avida invading. So there are certainly images of people of neighboring groups and their material culture, but how they're related to the development of Benin art, I don't have a good answer for.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, a couple more. Do you show reconstructions in class? And yeah, obviously the struggle of giving an impression of what it was like to enter one of these spaces with the columns covered with the brass plaques, all gleaming in the light, and versus the showing of one plaque in a museum environment. How do you help to reconstruct that for students?
Well, I like to show them this plaque that we've examined and to have them kind of think about that a little bit. I like to show them the model that I've made, which you could, I think, scan. I think it's in color in my book. You could scan and steal it if you wanted, to show them that idea. And that's sort of based on the composite testimony of the plaque that we looked at itself of the 1702 trading visit and the 1640 trader visit. When you put them together, you get that model that I showed you in the presentation. I also think it helps to ask students to just close their eyes and imagine it. Imagine this almost football-sized courtyard. Imagine pillars. Imagine the bronzes up there. Imagine them shining. Try to see what is it like to look at the one that's right across from you as you sit under the veranda. What is it like to try to see the one that's across the whole space from you? What is it like to have people in front of that? So to have people close their eyes and just think about it, to just try to imagine that space walking into it. How is it different in the daytime? How is it different at night with the oil lamps going? How does that make, how do you imagine it that way? And to just ask students to take a minute and a half as you walk them through this sort of guided meditation. What does it look like to walk through and experience the plaques?
Sounds great. Okay, one or two more. Yeah, someone wrote, it's interesting that you mentioned the comparison to the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Was the Benin Kingdom actively engaging in trade with European powers during this period?
Yes, so the Benin was trading with the Portuguese from the 1480s, and then they traded with the Dutch in the 16th century, as well as the Portuguese. European trade wasn't that interesting for Benin. It was never a big part of their GDP, if you will. So they were trading, but it wasn't so profitable for them. Benin, for example, cut off certain trades with the Portuguese because it wasn't profitable enough in 1508. But yes, they were trading with the Portuguese in the 1480s, and then ever after that, there was sometimes the Portuguese, sometimes the Dutch, sometimes the British, but they were trading at the port of Ubutan, which is not so far from Benin City, so it's sort of a riverine port near the kingdom.
Great. And we were talking about this a little bit before the talk, but the next question is about whether the museum will, present a reconstruction, and how close will that be to sort of being able to experience what the palace was like?
Yeah, I'm excited to see those models. I mean, I haven't been privy to any of those conversations, but I've been excited to see the models and to see the reconstructions. We don't have an architectural diagram for the palace as it moved over time. I imagine that the archaeological excavations they plan to do for the new MOA museum might help us actually understand the historical shape of the palace a little bit better. There are also other artworks that show the palace. So there are small caskets that open that are made in the shape of the palace. So there are many references in the Benin corpus to what the palace looked like. There are photographs from the 1897 after the British set fire to the palace that give you a little bit of a sense of the layout of the building. So there are no one has done the reconstruction yet that you would expect from an archaeological survey, but there's certainly an understanding of what the palace looked like.
Right. It occurred to me while I was listening to you that if we think about the early 16th century, there's Pope Julius II, you showed the Sistine Chapel, and there's also Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman Empire, and Isigie, these sort of three great rulers who are constructing these very important monuments that we study. And I wondered how that might be an interesting sort of intersection to talk about in an art history survey class. Do you have any thoughts about that? Is that a crazy idea I had?
No, I think that's a great idea. I think that's a great idea because I think students are maybe more comfortable or have heard their whole childhoods about, what European kings and queens are doing, right? And so they understand that sort of intuitively, that it's about power, that it's about image, that it's about money and control. And that's true for regions across the world. It's about power, it's about influence, it's about money and control. And I think when you can make those references for students, it maybe helps them link this into knowledge they already have. And I often compare Isigie and Catherine de' Medici because they're both under siege, right? They both end up becoming regents acting after, after a moment of great stress and strain, and they're repairing a court that doesn't get along with each other. And so I think, making those comparisons are fantastic. And to pull in Suleiman the Great or to pull in, rulers in China at that time would be an interesting way to show that many of the conceits of rule are the same across the world, right? Yeah. Ruling people, organizational psychology is the same across the globe.
Well, thank you very, very much, Kevin. This was really great. We really, really appreciate it. And just for everyone who's watching, we'll be posting the recording in the Smart History Commons on the Smart History website and also in our Facebook group. And thanks everybody for coming.